Thank you for attending our event, which has the title Thawing Ice, Rising Tensions, the Arctic at a Crossroads. This particular Geneva Security Debate is actually a partnership with the Arctic Law Program at the University of Maine School of Law and the Institute for Law, Science and Policy also. So each month in this debate series, we convene leading thinkers and practitioners for interactive discussions. And the aim is that these Geneva security debates will hopefully inform policymakers with innovative ideas and insights for addressing some of the challenges on the international agenda. In recent months, we've seen the Arctic more in the headlines, presented as something of a frontier of strategic interests and geopolitics, economic opportunity, and environmental urgency. It's become a hot topic, cold temperature but hot topic. Essentially, today we'll be examining the current state of play in the Arctic amid escalating geopolitical tensions. From military posturing and emerging economic opportunities to climate change and indigenous rights, our discussion will try to unpack the complex dynamics shaping the region. We'll be looking at a range of themes that are relevant to the Arctic, but also important for the wider world, for the international system. That means topics such as geopolitics, economics, security, science, and the environment. My name is Paul Jatkovets. It's my honor to chair this event. Here at the GCSP, I'm the Director for Mediation Peace Support, where we facilitate a number of unofficial dialogue processes that aim to help prevent or resolve conflict or help manage diplomatic tensions. I've worked on conflict mediation with various organizations and in different geographies, and previously I was a diplomat at the Australian Foreign Service, including in the Asia Pacific, in Africa and the Middle East. I'd also like to introduce the other panelists that you see before you, before making a few quick framing points for our orientation. So we have Professor Charles Nortje, who's the Benjamin Thompson Professor of Law and Director of Arctic Law Programs in the University of Maine School of Law. His areas of expertise are international law, maritime law, expedition law, the Arctic, and Afghanistan. Yes, Afghanistan. He's a visiting professor in the Climate Change Institute of the University of Maine, the Institute for the Environment at Brown University, a fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science, director of the International Institute of Law, Science and Policy here in Geneva, a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and the namesake of its Afghanistan Prize. We also have Professor Amanda Lynch, who's an atmospheric scientist and an authority on polar climate systems, climate and weather prediction, and climate policy analysis. She holds the Sloan Lindeman and George Lindeman Jr. Distinguished Professorship of Environment and Society at Brown University, has published over 130 articles, book chapters, and books, and is a fellow of several scholarly societies and national academies of science. She was awarded the Priestley Medal in 2008 and is currently chair of the research board of the UN World Meteorological Organization. And I think you have to go there before we finish. So 10 to 2, Amanda will be heading off for important meetings at the WMO. We also have online a distinguished speaker, Dr. Sarah Olsvik, who is international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. She served as a member of the Parliament of Denmark from 2011 to 15, and the Parliament of Greenland from 2013 to 18. Dr. Olsvik has been leader of the political party Inuit Ataqatigiit and was Vice Premier and Minister of Social Affairs, Families, Gender Equality and Justice in the government of Greenland from 2016 to 18. She was also a member of, and then the chairperson of the Standing Committee of Parliamentarians of the Arctic region from 2011 to 14. She also was appointed member of the Constitutional Commission of Greenland and is today a member of the Human Rights Council of Greenland. And then we also have Professor Matthias Finger, who is Professor Emeritus at the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne, Switzerland, and co-founder and director of the Global Arctic Project. He's been an assistant professor at Syracuse University, an associate professor at Columbia University in New York, professor of management of public enterprises at the Swiss Federal Institute of Public Administration, and between 2002 and 2020, the Swiss Post Chair in Management of Network Industries at EPFL. Since 2017, he's also a professor at the Faculty of Management at Istanbul Technical University, where he directs the Istanbul Center for Regulation. So that's the stellar panel that we have here today. And before we hear from them, I'll make a few more general remarks for framing. So here at the GCSP, one of the regions where we have a dedicated dialogue process is the Arctic. And that process is called the High North Talks. It's a dialogue track that we've been running for nearly 3 years now. It was launched following Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, when we realized that one region that would suffer from the ensuing geopolitical fallout would be the Arctic. So the High North Talks are an unofficial and discreet dialogue platform hosted by the GCSP that aspires to promote peace and international collaboration in the Arctic. Its participants are experts, thinkers, and officials from the Arctic states, as well as from other states that have a serious stake in the Arctic. Why do we have the High North Talks? Well, the lack of trust or constructive communication that characterizes today's West-Russia relations risks escalating into unintended accidents or military confrontation in the Arctic. The geopolitical confrontation has driven decisions on both sides to curb collaboration, which has serious mutually damaging consequences for the region and for the wider world. Polarization, increasing hostility, and the abandonment of cooperative mechanisms increase the danger that misperceptions and miscommunication can escalate into conflict. In that situation, we felt that it would be useful to establish confidential and unofficial exchanges to ensure that misunderstandings are clarified, that basic interests and red lines are understood, and miscalculations, dangerous incidents, or crises could be averted. So the High North Talks works on helping define guardrails or confidence-building measures to improve predictability and reassurance, to provide an informal channel of communication, to inject creative policy ideas for overcoming some of these challenges that I mentioned, and putting the Arctic back on a more positive trajectory. But of course, it's not only about security, or rather, it's in many ways about security, but security means so much more than it used to. In a context of geopolitical tensions, the High North Talks considers a range of urgent and interconnected issues, including the environment and climate change, security, governance, and scientific collaboration in the Arctic. The aim of the talks is to devise actionable policy ideas that can be conveyed to relevant officials in order to influence or at least inform decision-making on pressing issues relevant to the Arctic, and to restore some collaboration between Arctic states, at least on the most urgent issues. So that's what I wanted to say about our High North Talks. Now for today's debate, which obviously touches on many of the same issues, and builds on some of the work we've done in the High North talks. So over the next 90 minutes or so, we'll have a couple of rounds of discussion with the panelists, focused on these multi-dimensional challenges facing the Arctic and also how they might be overcome. Later on, we'll leave some time for interaction with the audience. So let's get started with a few questions, and I'll kick off with Charles Norchi. So we all would like to know about the US approach to all of these things. And of course, since the election of President Trump for another term, the Arctic has attracted newfound interest at the international level, though perhaps not in the way we might have expected. For example, the situation of Greenland in the context of international security has been a particular focus. There's even been talk of annexation of territory or the purchase of sovereign territory. So what do you make of all this as the expert coming from the States to be on this panel? What are we likely to see in terms of geopolitical maneuvering over the next few years? And what does it all mean also for international law? Over to you, Charles.
Well, thank you very, very much. Let me underscore that although I live in the United States, as does Amanda, we are, of course, independent academics, and with, at least in my case, with additional citizenship in Europe. So I can also speak from the standpoint of the European views of all of this as well. But I think that starting maybe more at 10,000 feet level, it's very, very important to consider the Arctic at a crossroads and why. And that has an awful lot to do, of course, with the international system and what particular statements and policies coming from the United States are having an impact on that system. Arctic conditions and outcomes are affected by trends in the international system, which over time have ranged from, of course, Hobbesian to near Kantian, where we're talking about the Arctic, and all of this is down to the behavior of states. And those states deploy varying assets in varying measures, including power, wealth, science, sometimes rectitude, asserting demands for access and for control. This is not new. In fact, it has roots in an earlier time of Arctic exploration. What is new is the intensity of those demands, voluminous, blustery, and asserted in ways not contemplated in the architecture of the post-World War II international system. In fact, we are experiencing an ever-loosening scaffolding of world public order, and this includes international law. Writing in the Financial Times a couple of days ago, the columnist Gillian Tett called this period the new age of volatility. And this affects many Arctics, for there's not simply one Arctic, and we'll hear more about that in different ways, affecting polar peoples, including indigenous people, states, some of which are literal to the Arctic Ocean, polar capable states, and of course, commercial entities engage in activities such as shipping and extractives. You also, Paul, alluded to geopolitical maneuvering and Greenland. We have Sarah here. So I won't say much about Greenland. She's the expert. But I would like to observe the following. When Denmark was controlled by Nazi Germany during the Second World War, the Roosevelt White House was alarmed that Germany via Denmark could control Greenland and threaten the American eastern coast. Hence, a security agreement was concluded by which the United States would, quote, have the right to construct, maintain, and operate such landing fields and seaplane facilities and radio and meteorological facilities as may be necessary. That agreement also provided that the United States would respect all legitimate interests in Greenland pertaining to the native population. Today, Patuxent, formerly Thule, is America's northernmost military installation. At the renaming ceremony for that base, U.S. Ambassador Alan Leventhal observed, this was a couple of years ago, We recognize the important role of this installation and the role it has played in ensuring our countries and all of North America remain safe and secure. Those arrangements, those security arrangements served US and allied security interests well through World War II, the Cold War, to the present. Now, the war in Ukraine, Russia, Russia's Arctic presence, China's quest for high North resources, and climate change have further enhanced the strategic value of Greenland to the United States, and that's some of what we're observing. However, it must be underscored that Greenland has been a partner to the United States and not a prize, and that has worked very well. You alluded to international law, Paul. Let me just finish with a comment on that. Clearly, prevailing trends are eroding the rules-based international order, and this has consequences for international law. However, it must be underscored that international law, which includes processes in addition to rules, will function so long as it is in the interest of states. There will be failures in application of existing prescriptions, but by and large, international legal instruments will persist as essential struts of the public order of the world community. For example, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to which the United States abides under customary international law, is critical for many Arctic needs: navigation, delimitation of marine space, settling and extended continental shelf claims, and so on. And this convention, UNCLOS, is part of a mosaic of international agreements applied to the Arctic, including multilateral and bilateral conventions or treaties, which we can discuss. For example, there's the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, there's the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, and then the important Arctic Council has spawned specialized agreements for search and rescue, for oil spill, and for scientific research. All of these function, albeit at variable speeds. But the question now that we'll have to confront is, will these begin to unravel? Will they fall into desuetude? And so the fundamental question for the Arctic, in my view, is the question for the international system: primacy or world order, and whose? Is the Arctic drifting now from the halcyon days of the Ottawa Declaration that established the Arctic Council? Will it begin to mirror this international system that increasingly marries realpolitik with transaction, wherein, quote, the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must, unquote, as Thucydides chronicled in his Melian dialogues more than 25 centuries ago? So the question: who will get what, when, and how in the Arctic? And another point to consider: do we now have a new great game? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles, for setting the context. It's a context of this new age of volatility, not only in geopolitics, but as you described, also in security and in international law and various other domains. We'll touch on many of those points further, including in particular Greenland and also the Arctic Council and multilateralism. One of the domains that you didn't cover yet, but which is perhaps the most urgent, is the environment, and in particular climate change, because climate change affects the Arctic faster than anywhere else in the world. Temperatures in that region are rising at a rate that's nearly 4 times faster than the global annual average rise. And of course, this has many impacts, including, and I'll just mention one, the thawing of what had been permanently frozen Arctic soils called permafrost. Arctic permafrost contains 2 or 3 times the carbon currently in the atmosphere, and it covers a very significant proportion of the Arctic states. So the release of even a small fraction of this large frozen carbon pool could actually substantially accelerate climate change globally. And even with meaningful multilateral cooperation, our capacity to adapt to risks like these is limited. So I have a question now for Amanda Lynch. What have you noticed happening in terms of how countries are intervening to mitigate some of these risks? Because it seems that the primacy of security and the economic possibilities that actually come from the ice melting override concerns about the impact of climate change. Is that the case in your view, or is there more going on than we're aware of? And what more do you think that can be done despite the deadlocks at the international level?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, indeed, climate change is at the centre of many of the challenges that we're seeing in the Arctic at present. It can't be ignored. In 2024, the global average temperature exceeded 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels for the first time in modern history. And how far above that level the temperature reaches depends on two things. First, human greenhouse gas emissions, and second, the response of the carbon cycle. The emissions increase relies on the additional contributions to emissions reductions to which nations commit per the Paris Agreement and perhaps subsequent agreements under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But current pledges suggest an increase by 2100 of 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is well above the 2 degrees Celsius increase that we've often considered to be a threshold for dangerous change. And as Paul mentioned, change in the Arctic is outstripping that by a factor of almost 4. So in the future, every day will be warmer than pre-industrial extreme temperatures. The Arctic Ocean will be ice-free for several months a year at least. The area of melt on the Greenland ice sheet will quadruple, and as Paul noted, the area of permafrost will rapidly decrease, perhaps by a half. And permafrost thaw impacts many things. Degradation of critical infrastructure, settlements of millions of people will become inaccessible, and it risks releasing pathogenic organisms into the atmosphere. But the response of the carbon cycle presents higher risks. As Paul noted, there's large quantities, 1,600 gigatons of carbon in the permafrost that we can measure near the surface, and even a small fraction of thaw could result in devastating results. But this is occurring in a context whereby economic and strategic opportunities are distracting from the limitations of the Paris Agreement to limit emissions. And because of the potential for these devastating consequences, interventions into the climate system, particularly through solar radiation management, which is often grouped under the rubric of geoengineering, are starting to look like a viable response. And so I'm seeing many experiments. There are groups dispersing sulfate particles into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight, spraying sea salt skyward to brighten clouds to make them more reflective, pumps being installed in ice floes to bring water to the surface to create more ice. In both Iceland and India, private sector actors are scattering tiny glass beads on glaciers to prevent the thaw. And then there are indirect experiments, giant curtains anchored on the seabed to block warm water from melting ice. And that project in particular has been objected to by several indigenous organisations. In fact, there are at least 61 different interventions that have been more than proposed, that have been investigated, tested in labs and piloted in the environment. And so geoengineering of this form, solar radiation management, raises many questions concerning procedural justice, because treatments can be applied unilaterally and typically are. Distributive justice, because the effects are almost always, if they're considered successful, transboundary. And intergenerational justice, because it presents a moral hazard whereby the urgency to address emissions controls is reduced. And indeed, even when these approaches work, They require continuous treatment, which demands stable social and economic arrangements. So indeed, from both the national security and economic development perspectives, the potential for securing revenue from fossil fuel and other industries while intervening in climate change in these ways presents an attractive option. So in answer to your question, the primacy of security and the economic potentialities are incentives to move away from meaningful multilateral cooperation because there are other strategies, but they raise many more challenging questions. And then finally, all of this activity raises the question of whether there is a basis in international law for agreements that can cover the diverse practices that could fall under the rubric of geoengineering. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda, for bringing in that very sober but so critical scientific perspective, perhaps representing the most urgent challenge of all when we discuss the Arctic. In fact, in our dialogue track, one of the main messages that comes out regularly has been that, given the scale of the crisis, including what you just said, the environmental crisis, it's imperative that science be freed from the political and ideological influence that otherwise characterizes international affairs. So surely states should be encouraged to compartmentalize when it comes to physical threats to humanity. That is, to work together on mutually important existential issues, even when they're divided on other matters. So in that regard, of course, it's understandable that there would be, and there has been, a strong reaction to Russia's behavior vis-à-vis Ukraine and its flagrant abuse of the most basic international norms. At the same time, I'm not saying but, and at the same time, there's an urgent crisis unfolding in the Arctic that demands serious and joint attention. There's also, in international law, we talked about agreements and conventions and so on, there is this thing called the 2017 Agreement on Enhancing International Arctic Scientific Cooperation, which obliged the state parties to facilitate collaboration in a number of ways. These obligations were agreed in the form of an international treaty and still stand. Next point, obviously, trust between scientists should not be conflated with trust or lack thereof between political elites, not least because political alignments and actors shift regularly, whereas scientists are occupied with the long-term and universal questions of human survival and human advancement. And finally, as we've seen in past eras of geopolitical rupture, for example, during the Cold War, even during the worst times of the Cold War, science diplomacy can actually be an effective tool for diffusing tensions and addressing mutually dangerous threats. So these topics can serve as an important entry point to rebuilding trust. Now, Matthias Finger, so you've engaged on Arctic matters for many years and published some books on what you call the global Arctic, with a new one released just in recent days. By the way, a great book, that one. One of the best for anyone who wants to really understand the Arctic better. And that's called Global Arctic, The New Dynamics of Arctic Governance. But what I wanted to ask you about is the interplay between the major change factors that matter as much for international relations generally as they do in the Arctic itself. Geopolitics, geoeconomics, environmental concerns, transport routes, etc. Global trends as applied through the Arctic lens. How do you see these major global factors driving change in the Arctic? And in terms of Arctic governance, do you think that some of these factors will play an increasing role, positively or negatively, or perhaps even affect change in how the Arctic is governed in the future?
Thank you. Maybe a little bit of history. I started my interest in the Arctic when I was studying in Finland in the Cold War in the 70s, Tampere Peace Research Institute. And, then I moved more into management and technology management, things like that. But I have never lost the interest in Arctic matters. And we've always stayed in touch. So in the Cold War, the Arctic was, I don't know, colonial space, colonialized by the nation states. And then, there was this brief period at the end of the Cold War and before the new Cold War, however you want to call it, Crimea and then Ukraine, that the Arctic became seen as a region, actually. Before, it was not really seen as an autonomous region. And so, as Gorbachev said, a zone of peace. But ultimately, the underlying idea was sustainable development. We're in the 90s. We're in the Rio context, sustainable development of the Arctic to the benefit of everybody. And so that created all kind of, coming to your question about governance, that created, the Arctic Council, sort of governance mechanisms for the Arctic. But ultimately, it turned out to be a brief period. And so the whole question now is, what comes after? And when we started this project, Global Arctic, with my friends from Finland, from the Cold War, from the 70s, we had realized that there was something new. The Arctic was now global again. It was global in the Cold War, but it was basically a theater of the Cold War. But it became global because of because of a series of factors. And so that affected the Arctic, a series of drivers, if you want. Amanda already spoke about it. I think that what we really saw, and we started our project in 2013, 14, the Global Arctic Project. We were very much under the impression of climate change. Climate change and maybe the only science that is really relevant in this is Earth system science, whereby what happens in the Arctic is affecting the global climate system. And, of course, global warming in the Arctic is not the fault of the Arctic. It's the fault of the global economy. So I think that was the first idea to sort of say the global nature of the Arctic is because of the Earth system dynamics that comes with it. But then, we looked at other factors because climate change is sort of the underlying factor that makes natural resource exploration more probable, more likely, more easy, more accessible. Oil, gas, minerals. We've always exploited minerals and coal mostly in the Arctic, but now at a more massive scale because of thawing ice. So, and that again is a totally global thing. I mean, the need for these resources is not the Arctic. It's not the 4 million people in the Arctic that need these resources. And it's not, the 4 million people in the Arctic that will benefit. That's the resource curse that we have seen in Congo and many other countries already. So same thing. It's a global demand for resources affecting the Arctic. And with that comes transport infrastructures, ports, all that, pipelines, trains, things like that. So that's another global thing because the investments are not by Arctic actors. They are from, if you look at from China, from Korea, from other global actors that are interested in these resources exploration. So then I think the fourth dimension, which is generally under, and I'm not totally clear yet, but digitalization. This new digital picture of the Arctic, thanks to satellites, monitoring, or started with the monitoring of the climate, monitoring of resources, monitoring of pollution, military. And so digitalization, again, a totally global thing. Who's there? The Googles, the Starlinks, these kind of global companies are getting the data, which are then commercially used. And then fifth factor, not new, militarization has always happened. In the Cold War, it was there, but never really dismantled. So it's still there, and we're just building on that again. So we can continue where in this brief period of the 90s, early 2000s, we sort of had some military agreements, but they're, as you know, they don't exist anymore. So, and then my last point here is, and maybe that this is I'm a little bit less sure, but maybe it's influenced by my last almost 10 years of work in Turkey now. The West against the rest, the BRICS perspective, the Chinese perspective, the Indian perspective, the Korean perspective on the Arctic. Those are all important actors. They invest, they look for resources, and they want to be at the table. And now coming to governance, they were not really there in this Arctic Council. There were some observers, but I think that the Global Arctic Project, when we created it, we sort of said it's legitimate for non-Arctic actors to sit around the table discussing the future of the Arctic. And it's a reality. They are there. So better include them than exclude them. So that was the, so what will define the future governance of the Arctic or not, if there is a governance to be or not. But as I said, each of these drivers bring new actors into the Arctic. And, the governance will in any case be more complex because there are more actors. They're not just nation states, they're multinational corporations. And actually, I've previously written with a Russian colleague when we looked at who is active in the Arctic in company-wise, those are mostly state-owned enterprises. On the Russian side, on the European side, in the US is not like this, but still very much supported by the government. So governance will be more complex. Some of these drivers may reinforce each other, like global warming will make resources more accessible, but some of them, and more explored, of course, and more extracted, but then some of them may cancel each other out because the permafrost will make it very difficult to build infrastructures in the Arctic. So it's not, for me, it's difficult to say what is the future governance, except that it's going to be more complex, more dynamic, and more global in any case, not just militarily, still probably the most militarized region of the world, but also in terms of resources. If you look at the Arctic resources potential, and we don't really have a very clear picture. We know about gas potential, oil potential. Mineral is more difficult because underneath the ice shield in Greenland, but still, and then, the environment, the environmental dynamics, that you highlight. And so I don't know, I'll conclude here, but maybe the Arctic as a zone of experimentation, where we will experiment. I very much agree with you, Amanda. It's experimentation of geoengineering of and whose interest, who is driving it, in whose interest is it, who's opposing it, and in any case, we're looking again for a techno-fix for a problem that is actually not a purely technical problem.
Thank you, Matthias. So you've described an Arctic that is a region of itself, but also for many reasons that you described, a global Arctic interconnected with the rest of the world in so many ways. And you also were a little more expansive about future governance of that space than perhaps others are, including your argument that others may warrant a seat at the table. At the same time, it's a region that is inhabited by 8 nation states. And like other regions in the world, the governance mechanism kind of circles around those states that inhabit the region. So I suppose there's a tension there. To what extent can you be creative and expansive when actually it is while it's global, it's also a self-contained region in itself. And that's where I pass on to someone I think will have a slightly different take on what you just said, and that is Dr. Sarah Olsvig, who is online. So Sarah, as the chair of one of the big indigenous peoples organizations in the Arctic, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, you've had a close involvement in the Arctic Council, and you've seen that body evolve through good times and also recently more difficult times. As we know, Arctic indigenous peoples have played and continue to play a crucial role in Arctic governance and scientific cooperation, and they actively contribute to efforts to continue international communication and cooperation in times of tension, including indigenous peoples organizations in decision-making in the Arctic Council has been one of the most novel and inspiring innovations for an international forum, where typically in international forums we see discussions dominated by states. And perhaps there's something for other multilateral forums to learn from this experience. In fact, there are 6 indigenous peoples organizations that serve as permanent participants in the Arctic Council. So not observers, but permanent participants, meaning they are actual members of the Arctic Council and take part in decision-making, unlike observers, including observer states, which Matthias mentioned, who merely observe. So really quite a novel and important feature of the Arctic Council. Indigenous peoples of the Arctic have used this opportunity to raise their concerns and advocate for cross-border cooperation and peace in the Arctic. But I wanted to ask you how that special format and the atmosphere it brought to that forum has been affected by the geopolitical circumstances of the last 3.5 years. And more broadly, is the Arctic Council still fit for purpose? Do you think it'll get through this turmoil and flourish again? Or is there a risk that some of these innovations may be diluted and the Arctic Council may not get back to business as usual? What's your prognosis in this regard, Sarah?
No, thank you. And first, on a personal note, I'm very happy you share my excitement to having submitted my PhD in these very busy times of being ICC chair, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, our organization representing Inuit across state borders here in Galaslit Nunat. I'm in Nuuk, Greenland, Galaslit Nunat, so calling in from here, Alaska, Canada, and Chukotka, Russia. I will be defending in August, so not quite doctor yet, but happy to report that I have been informed that the thesis has been accepted for defense. As an indigenous leader and a person who lives in the Arctic, of course, it is very concerning and at times very scary times. I have found myself waking up many mornings checking the news as the first thing to see what is going to happen today. In January, when a big plane landed here in Nuuk, we were seeing with our own eyes how people that came with the plane, groups of influencers were approaching our children on the street, offering $100 bills to engage in some kind of a propagandic process. So we are indeed in the middle of it here in Kalaallit Nunaat, although we have felt that we are quite far away from much of the international development at times. But I think that also, again, speaks to the global nature of the Arctic, as it has already been mentioned. Although I, of course, personally do not like to have my 7-year-old son come home asking whether he will be taken by Trump or if our country will be taken by Trump, I also try to look at this development with eyes of understanding the context, understanding the incentives behind the interest for the Arctic, understanding also the incentives behind the interest not only for territory but resources, as it has already been mentioned. And we do have to go quite far back in history to see the first mentionings of interest of annexing or purchasing territories, or even things like that happening, the way that Alaska was purchased, the way that there was discussion about annexing Kalaallit Nunaat Greenland already in the 1860s, when there had been big reports written by the US on the resources living and non-living here. So it is not a new thing. The big difference I think right now is, of course, the unpredictability, and that's also been mentioned. Another difference that I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about is the changes in governance structures. So, of course, we've had the UN establishment in the 1940s after the Second World War, and prior to that, the League of Nations. But the big decolonization processes also sparked developments in the Arctic. The development of the rights of indigenous peoples, their recognition in the UN, all of those processes have led to where we are today as Arctic peoples and nations. And yes, we do live across 8 very different nation states, but within each of these states, we have very different, but also very strong self-government agreements and arrangements. Let's take Kalaallit Nunaat Greenland as an example again. You'll see how we, since 1979, have had our own parliament, our own government, and other indigenous peoples across the Arctic, especially Inuit, have also followed along, establishing their own legislative assemblies, representative institutions, and so forth. And this means that decisions that we take in the Arctic are also not isolated just to us. You can look at the examples of deciding to build new airports, or since 2010, the legislation approved in Kalaallit Nunaat and in Denmark that the people of Kalaallit Nunaat will decide what to mine and what not to mine. So decisions taken in our own parliament here as peoples of the Arctic will affect how the states can conduct their foreign policy, even their security and defense policies. And that's what we are seeing playing out. This might also create a situation of some confusion of who controls what. And that, I think, is what we're seeing today on a more broader and more sort of outspoken way in media. And I think that we do share a responsibility to teach ourselves not just to think in states, but also inform ourselves of how our self-government arrangements and the different nations and peoples that live in the Arctic have interacted and built on the state system, but built on it in the sense of widening determination processes so that it is no longer very simple. It is actually quite complicated. So we are indeed in times of, difficulties and complexities, and we will have to find a way to navigate that. And I think that is going to be an issue that will not be easy to discuss on a broad and sort of mainstream media sense. We've already seen it, so both in 2019 and also this year, when the sort of renewed interest of the US president have been expressed in media continue to refer to this being a decision to be taken by Denmark, while Denmark is saying that is a decision to be taken by the people of Kalaallit Greenland. So we do share a responsibility to try and encompass and embrace that complexity and be able to communicate how these decision-making structures and arrangements actually do function, and be able to discuss international development in a more sort of complex reality. What I also want to talk a little bit about is, of course, as you say, the Arctic Council. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was a co-founder of the Arctic Council. ICC already in 1989 decided to engage in the then Finnish initiative, which led to the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, AEPS, which then also led to the Arctic Council, and engaged in the working groups that also existed prior to the Arctic Council. So apart from what you already presented, Paul, the Arctic Council consisting of 8 states and 6 permanent participants, so 14 entities that take decisions in the Arctic Council by consensus. The machinery of the Arctic Council is the 6 working groups that produce knowledge. And these working groups are the ones that today are restarting. They are working very hard to ensure that projects on permafrost thaw, on suicide prevention, on management of solid waste, on shipping and marine issues, on indigenous people's health in the Arctic, and so forth, that they are actually able to re-engage across state borders and re-engage in producing knowledge. And that is for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the very, very key thing about the Arctic Council that is so valuable. Of course, apart from having a council where you're able to gather 8 states and 6 indigenous peoples organizations, even in difficult times, and I'll get back to that, I want to highlight the working groups. And as late as yesterday and the day before, the new chairship of the Arctic Council, the Kingdom of Denmark, met in person with the 6 indigenous peoples organizations and with the working group secretariats and chairs to discuss exactly how to ensure a movement, a positive development in the ongoing work and restart of the work. The Norwegian chairship that were in effect from 2023 to 25 have been extremely successful. They have found ways to ensure in a differentiated way on the different levels of the Arctic Council, so working group level, senior Arctic officials level, and ministerial level, to re-engage in cooperation. And the current chairship, the Kingdom of Denmark, led by Naalakkersuisut, the government of Kalaallit Greenland, are building on that positive development. And I am very happy to see that the past 2 days' work meeting in Romsa, Tromsø, seem to have been successful, and they have been able to discuss further how exactly to continue, on what exactly to continue the work around. As it was mentioned by the new Arctic ambassador of the Kingdom of Denmark a few weeks ago at another panel I attended here in Nuuk, and it was a public panel, so I'm confident I can repeat what he said. It is not the Arctic Council as such who is preventing cross-border cooperation on research and science. It's the individual states. And I do want to repeat a call that I have made several times for the states to reconsider, to reopen cooperation on research also with Russian institutions and researchers. It was touched upon briefly on, for example, permafrost thaw or other areas where we are deeply dependent on being able to share data and share in the efforts to ensure we have the necessary knowledge to act on both permafrost thaw, climate change at large, and other challenges that we are facing in the Arctic. And I think that's one of the big challenges that each state is now facing. How can we ensure that the Arctic Council, or the core purpose of the Council, producing knowledge, can actually be done in a way that is responsive to today's challenges, including climate change? And I think that's something that we will have to continue push for, knowing that it's difficult and it will not be business as usual, but there will be there can be and should be ways to re-engage in science and knowledge production with also scientists and institutions across the border to Russia. The other challenge is, of course, the current development in the US. The decline in funding and the closing down of institutions is something that we are already seeing and feeling as Arctic peoples. So that is a big concern that we are seeing these developments within the US in terms of what the US can contribute with in the work of the Arctic Council and beyond. So we are facing some very, very serious challenges that are dependent on especially those two states. And we will, from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, of course, continue to call on ramping up the science and knowledge production, including indigenous peoples, in designing and conducting projects, and including also the knowledge of indigenous peoples in these areas. And I do want to end by saying a few things of some of the concerns we are also highlighting. And I was fortunate to be part of a very, very informative seminar in April in the US on climate interventions and geoengineering. We are one of the organizations who were approached by one of the projects that was just mentioned. That was the one on seabed curtains. And it is entirely correct that there was no support from Kalaallit Nunaat, neither from the municipality or the government, or from us as an indigenous peoples organization, to test these seabed curtains in the waters around here in Kalaallit Nunaat. They were particularly proposed to be tested in the Ilulissat ice fjord. As you might imagine, an ice fjord is a huge power. We do not imagine that anything can be put on the seabed of an ice fjord and then stay there for very long, because the nature of an ice fjord is, of course, that these huge powers of ice will change whatever is on the seabed as they move around in the fjord. And in addition, of course, this ice fjord is in the Disco Bay area, where a large proportion of the halibut fish breed, and it's a habitat of the halibut fish, which is a very big proportion of the Greenland economy in terms of export of halibut. So there was no positive tones from anyone here in Kalaallit Nunaat on that proposed climate intervention project or geoengineering project. And using that as an example, including the ones on producing ice floats or pouring fresh water on ice to increase the albedo effect, or pouring beads on ice to try and mitigate the melt. We initiated a process to engage with different institutions here in Kalaallit Nunaat to better understand, do we even have the regulations in place to deal with both science sector, but also private sector processes or projects that are related to climate interventions or can be categorized as climate interventions and geoengineering. And the clear response was no, we don't have the regulation. And generally, there's a big concern that the pressure from the outside, again, kind of repeating centuries of polar exploration that has also been used in the name of colonization, that the same feeling we are facing today, that in the name of somebody's greater good, let us use your land and territory and resources to test this and that. And that is generally being questioned, of course, from us in the Arctic. And we've seen also on Sápmi, and the Sápmi, so the land of the Sami people in Norway, Sweden, Finland, they also live across the border into Russia, that there has been testing of stratospheric instances of stratospheric projects without the consent of the Sami. So we really do face a challenge in terms of ensuring that the rights of indigenous peoples are not violated in the name of climate interventions and geoengineering projects, or as somebody has been saying to us, in the name of a greater good. So that's been the story of colonization, and we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. And this relates back to the changed governance systems we have in the Arctic. We are no longer in the 1800s. We are no longer in 1917 when 16 or 17, when there was a bargaining of trying to include Galashilat Greenland in the deal about the West Indian Islands, when Denmark sold those to the US. We are no longer in the interwar period, where other sort of reasoning behind accessing Galashilat Nunat also meant that there was access to cryolite, which meant that the Western Alliance was able to win the Second World War by producing airplanes. No, today we are in an era where there is a self-government introduced, and the peoples of the Arctic enjoy and exercise their right of self-determination. And that poses for us a more complex world, but a complex world that we should be able to embrace and continue to build on, even in these difficult times that we are facing today. So I'll end it here and look forward to the dialogue. Rønner.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, if that was your defense of your doctorate, then I think you would have the title, in my view, by now. Anyway, very important, so many important points there. We often have the Arctic presented to us as a place of geopolitical competition, but of course, there are people that live there. There are people that are affected directly by all of these things that we're discussing. And it's so critical that their voices be part of the decision-making, if not the main part of decision-making, as an expression of their right to self-determination. So point there to remind us of that fact. Now we're in the stage where we will have a Q&A discussion. So if people do have questions in the room here, then please raise your hands. I do have a few already coming in from online as well. So I might just read them out. I might sneak in my own question also. And then read them out and see if there are any others, and then perhaps go back to the panel to answer what people wish to answer. So let's say this is my taking advantage of my chair's position, but so Denmark taking over the Arctic Council, it's a quite complicated time for that, because not only are there internal complications, Greenland on course for determining its own future as part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but also being such a critical element of the chairship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. And at the same time, these challenges coming from the US, unexpected challenges over the sovereignty of Greenland, and also the geopolitical confrontation continuing, as well as the administration in the US, not being a big champion, let's say, of climate change and how to resolve this problem. What can Denmark achieve, given all this that's happening, both internally and geopolitically, really over the next 2 years? It's quite a challenge. So that's my question, particularly for Sarah. But then there are a few online questions, and these are not my questions, so I'm just going to read them because they came from participants. So what can be done? This is the first one. What can be done to stop Russia's creeping advancement, recent deployment of military bases, and arbitrary appropriation of the continental shelf in the Arctic? That came from one participant online. Then on climate change, it's a question about an important group, which is conspiracy theorists. So excluding them from the discussion can also be harmful. How do we engage more constructively with this community of conspiracy theorists without legitimizing disinformation so they don't feel left out of the conversation? And at the same time, how do we address the spread of misinformation while safeguarding freedom of speech? So whoever wants to take that, good luck. Then where do ethics fall alongside with all of these developments that we've discussed? To Sarah, the next question to Sarah, where does mining now stand in Greenland under the new government? What are the main mines that operate, and might there be any new mines opening soon? And to Charles, might Trump express an interest in Svalbard soon? And anyone else in the room who wants to add to that already very complicated group of questions, please.
Engineering, do we know who is funding this type of project exactly? Is there a kind of mapping? Is it state-led project or private equities? Because then it tells us something on who is leading that.
So primarily these are the exploratory approaches are being done by scientists, often funded by various governments. And Sarah's comment about this, idea of sacrificing local communities to the so-called greater good is an unfortunate characteristic of those arguments, and has come into play also in things like, installation of windmills on traditional reindeer grounds and things like that. So those are exploratory. However, the ones that have been tested in the field, actually deployed, those are all private sector efforts, because as has been noted, I think by more than one person on this panel, there's not really a regulatory framework that can govern this beyond some ideas about transboundary pollution. And so the amounts at the moment are small. There's been an idea of cooling credits being proposed along with carbon credits, but it hasn't been enacted. And so far it's a relatively small group. That said, a serious concern is that because of this greater good argument, that there will be philanthropists and benefactors who see this as being an urgency to be addressed. And so we may find that there are some of these unilateral actions, and in fact this has happened already at a smaller scale, that there are these unilateral actions that are being taken under this rubric of the greater good, and they're all private in their origin.
Can I just add something? I mean, don't be naive on these things. I mean, these things are only done if there is government behind somewhere financing something or taking guarantees or something. Otherwise, the ideas don't come from government. The technology doesn't come from government, but ultimately the financing risks of these kind of things are backed by governments. And you know,
that's
and
the
urgency will make it happen.
Yeah, you're right, the urgency can make it happen, but there are many documented instances where governments were in fact not involved and prosecuted people who were engaged in it.
But anyway, we'll discuss.
Charles, what would you like to tackle? I don't think
You don't
Do I
need
not
it.
need this? Oh, no. Okay. Excellent. Well, there was a question about, and it's a very good one, about the Russian claim to an extended continental shelf that would indeed touch the North Pole. Now, the way the process works is a state party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea collects the requisite evidence to support a claim. That evidence is then conveyed to an entity at the UN in New York City called the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. The CLCS, or the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, is not a legal tribunal. It is a panel of scientists who simply, and very importantly, evaluate the scientific evidence and indicate that it will or will not support a claim. Then the country, being a party to UNCLOS that has submitted the material to the CLCS, hears from the Commission, then the country will make its claim, presumably based on the evidence. Now, the issue for this particular claim, if anybody has seen it, it's quite extensive, the Russian claim. It will overlap with the claims of other states. When that happens, then you've got a contest, and if Russia does formalize its claim, there could be a diplomatic solution. It could go to litigation, the International Court of Justice, all kinds of, those kinds of avenues. The Svalbard question is an interesting one. Good Lord, Norway's got enough on its plate with Russia already. They don't really need the United States making a claim to a sovereign land, which, by the way, is also governed by a treaty with many, many other countries involved. So it would be a very, very complicated move. But the current incumbent of the White House has a big appetite.
Okay, Sarah, online, there are a few questions for you.
Yes, if I start with the question on mining, not being able to speak on behalf of the government of Kalaalleq Naalakkersuisut, the government of Greenland, my impression is that the policy that is sort of the biggest interest of people is usually the policy around whether or not there's a zero tolerance towards uranium mining. It's my impression that policy is staying, but other than that, Kalaalleq Greenland have expressed through many strategies published, written, and through many governments that the Kalaalleq Greenland does want to be a mining nation. And yes, our island is still covered mostly by ice, but there is a lot of deposits of minerals that are available in terms of not being covered by ice, and all of that has been quite well mapped by the geological services of Kalaalleq in Denmark, but also by, for example, the US Geological Services and others. So we have a relatively high degree of knowledge of what minerals are where. I think the biggest challenge has been the early sort of self-government era ambitions to initiate a list or a long sort of list of large-scale projects has not been realized. And that is more related to world market prices on minerals fluctuating, and also the costs of establishing mines, especially large-scale mines, in a place like Kalaalleq in the Arctic, where you will not find a port or a road to the place where the mineral is usually. So there are external factors mostly that have meant that the ambitions of opening up large-scale, for example, iron mine or other kinds of mines have not happened. And it seems that there's been a change in strategy towards medium-sized and smaller-scale mining. And we do see a few projects that are open now. And we just, I believe it was last week, saw that the EU was also announcing their interest in investing in one of these smaller scale mines. But the status is, of course, that there's a high degree of knowledge of what minerals are here, especially the critical minerals or rare earth minerals that have been subject of attention to many others in the world. But the decisions are taken in the parliament and government here in Kalaalleq on whether to mine or not, and also how to do this mining. So there's a quite strict regulation set up on both environmental impact assessments and also social impact assessments, and reporting measures in terms of ensuring upholding the contracts that are signed trilaterally between the government, the business in question, and also the municipality, so the community of the area. And those regulations are continuously renewed and refined since 2010, when Gelalfnat took over responsibility of the mineral resources. There is no new licenses given, and as far as I know, that policy has also not changed with the new government to offshore oil exploration, and there is no activity on that area as well right now. I think what they are focusing on is to further develop the hydropower potentials, and also exploring possible power to X projects using hydropower, and hopefully, or I think the government is hoping for some technologies to be developed to be able to have that also as an export in the future. So that was on the mining. I think on chairing the Arctic Council, yes, there are some internal things that they needed to get in place, and as you've seen, it's an Inuk, a Greenlander, Galaler, who is the Arctic ambassador of the Kingdom of Denmark. That's the first. And then also the chairship is held by Naalakkersuisut, the government of Gelalfnat, but the kingdom is working collaboratively in between the three governments in conducting the chairship, and the national senior Arctic official is from Denmark. So they are working well together. I think that they have a list of ambitions of events and activities and projects. I think their biggest challenge will be to ensure that they have an equal treatment of the 8 states and 6 permanent participants, in terms of making sure that everybody will want to stay at the table. And that's the diplomatic challenge they are facing. It seems that they are, capable of that, taking that challenge on. Rønner.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Now, Amanda's about to leave us for another important engagement, but would you like to offer some final thoughts?
Sure. I would like to just briefly address in what soon to be Dr. Olsvig mentioned about Arctic cooperation, particularly over the last 3.5 years, and how challenging that's been in the context of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and then with the change in the US administration and the aggressive tones that we're seeing there. One of the things that I can observe is that in the scientific community, that collaboration does continue, at least at an informal level, and that we try very hard to keep those channels of collaboration, of expertise, sharing data open, and it relies very strongly on personal relationships that we value deeply. And I would also note, because I'm heading back to the negotiating room at the World Meteorological Organization, that during all of these times, exchange of climate data has been continuous, and it has not stopped in the last 75 years. And that has been through all sorts of different international conflicts. The exchange of climate data has been continuous through that whole period, and that should be, I think, some cause for hope.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Apologies.
No problem. Now, Matthias, there was one new question based on what you said. So you mentioned potential non-governance of the Arctic. What would be the consequences of non-governance?
First consequences will be on Sarah, on the indigenous peoples. Resources exploration without much regulation, pollution, land grabbing. I think we should look at what has happened in the developing countries. I think we can learn very much from that. I think that would be the consequence of non-governance. I'm not sure. I think there will be some sort of governance. You know, it's never anarchic. I mean, if I go with my global Arctic perspective, we have to. It's not just we always, in these diplomatic things, we always think that it's only nation states, but corporations are very important, and they use the states for their purposes. So they will be involved in one way or another. And in my view, I'm a pragmatist. It's better to have them at the table than to have them lobby behind the doors, behind the scenes. Fishing. I mean, we already see the Chinese fleet fishing empty the whole South Pacific. It will be the Arctic will be the next that is fished empty by Chinese. It's these kind of things and maybe we will. I'm very happy what Sarah said about this geoengineering, but I think we will, it's too risky to test geoengineering in Switzerland, but it will be less risky to test it somewhere else and more urgent because the climate is more dramatic. But I'm not sure it's in anybody's interest.
And during the Cold War, there's a reason why the nuclear power didn't test in their own territory.
Absolutely.
Dumped that on somebody else. With respect to the Arctic Council and governance, and Sarah made this point, so much that is important with respect to the Arctic Council is occurring with the various working groups, the functional working groups. And even if there's some teetering with the architecture, the institutional architecture of the AC, of the Arctic Council, those working groups will continue. It'll be up to the leadership of the Arctic Council whether it's going to be reformed in any sort of a way. We have in this town the Human Rights Council. It used to be the Human Rights Commission. I'm not saying the Arctic Council requires that kind of restructuring, but there were good reasons why that institution was changed. I'd like to ask Sarah something, if I may. And Sarah, you said something that we hadn't been thinking about so much, those of us who are scientists and scholars in the United States. We've been worried very much about the loss of science funding with the National Science Foundation being decimated, NOAA being decimated. Amanda, who was just here, has lost mega grants, well into the millions that were cut by the National Science Foundation. My project at my law school, we've lost grants in the lower millions because the guy with the chainsaw came in and simply was cutting.
Well, he's gone now, isn't he?
His chainsaw's still there. But what I hadn't thought as deeply about is something that Sarah said, which is how this is actually affecting people in the Arctic. Yeah. It's easy to sit in the United States at a big university and say, oh, I've lost my research funding. But the consequences of Arctic peoples, primarily indigenous peoples, is profound.
Sarah, any quick reaction?
Yes. So I would say the paradox is exactly that, Alaska, here we have indigenous peoples, Inuit in Alaska, other indigenous peoples. And to my knowledge, we are up to, 31 communities across the Alaskan coast who face relocation because of permafrost thaw and coastal erosion. So this is not a foreign issue only related to someone far away. It's happening in the US. And I would think that it's in the interest of the US to continue creating and producing attention and knowledge to the changes that are very, very real. Other things that I've also raised in other panels is the unpredictability of the weather. The extreme weather events that we are also facing here this winter, this spring in Nuuk, we were seeing our fjord looking like the Ilulissat ice fjord, full of icebergs and ice so that we could actually travel less on the fjord. So this prevented both people from going hunting. It prevented the tourism sector from doing their whale safaris. It prevented even search and rescue accessibility. So these are events that we will be facing, and we are increasingly facing, and people in the US are as well. So to me, it's a strange paradox. But most importantly, of course, as Arctic indigenous peoples, we are seeing these changes happening at a faster pace, and it's more deeply affecting not just our livelihoods but our human rights. So it's a big concern to us, both the defunding and ending of research projects, but also the defunding of the UN. So later this year, we will be negotiating in Geneva, hopefully a finalization of a treaty to prevent plastics pollution. And why is that important for us? Well, because microplastics are entering into our foods. As Arctic indigenous peoples, we live from the foods in our seas and on land, and especially those in the seas contain microplastics that might affect our fertility and so forth. So there are so many multilateral processes where everybody are needed, and the current development is of big concern. And it will be very, very devastating for indigenous peoples all over the world if we continue to not be able to take the necessary decisions.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We like to finish on time, so I'll just quickly wrap up. I hope the conversation continues. We will have an opportunity in the future to come back to this. I think from the chair's perspective, I would say that I think we've shown that in many ways the Arctic is a microcosm of the world at large, and something of a laboratory also for problem solving. So many of the phenomena in the Arctic are major problems for the world. The functioning of multilateral diplomacy, climate change, geoeconomics, the rules-based order, human rights, etc. So it's all happening now at a furious pace in the Arctic, in a region that many of us might have thought was shielded from the big fissures happening elsewhere in the world. So I suppose one pithy slogan that might capture what we've been discussing is whatever happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's certainly worth being aware of these trends and paying attention to the Arctic, precisely because it's a microcosm of much broader global issues. And we can't afford to wait until the geopolitics have sorted themselves out before we tackle these problems emphatically. So for that reason, certainly we at GCSP will continue to pay close attention. We hope that you will too. We thank you all for being here, whether in person or online. Thank you for participating. I think it was a very rich discussion. I also thank my colleagues, Inela, Catalina, Florian, for putting together the event. And I wish you all a good day. I look forward to discussing it again. It's important. We should do it again. And see you at the next Geneva Security Debate. Thank you.
As the laboratory of the anthropos.